Good morning, Chris. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm all right.
Are you hosting?
Yes, I'm the one hosting.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you for making the time and
Yeah. No, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me.
you're welcome. So we should start in a few minutes.
Okay. Sure.
Waiting for more people to join.
I'm just gonna check if I can share my. Trying to remember how to do this. No, there's no. I don't have permission to share. Is there any way to fix that?
Sana, you can. Did you create the meeting?
No, it was created by
The marketing people. But did they give you the rights to ask
let me just see.
Otherwise, you have to get hold of the Bofo and ask to get permission.
Yeah. I have a presentation. Otherwise, I can just go through it, which is also fine. But then you'll just see me quite a lot.
Chris, do you want to email the PowerPoint to me? Let me see. It looks like I do have. Looks like I can share on my side. Can you share it to me?
I can. Sure. What should I do then? I'll just ask you to change slides or yeah. Okay. What's your email address?
So it's NDLOV. So the same email we've been communicating on.
Okay. Oh yes, of course. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I've got that somewhere. Hold on. Let me just check where I've saved this. I'll save it quickly.
Do you want to try? I just changed you to the presenter. Just see if you can share right now.
Oh, I can now. Oh, that's good.
Okay, lovely.
Thank you. That's easier
Thank
actually.
you.
So I should share my screen. Okay. Then share that. So is that? Can I just ask? Is that sharing my screen?
Yes, we can see a screen. If you can put it into presentation mode.
Into what?
Do it the slideshow, Chris.
Oh yeah, slideshow. View slideshow. There we go. On the current slide.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. That looks good.
All right.
Perfect. Now it's not perfect anymore.
No. The thing is, I can't see. All I can see is that screen. I can't.
You've turned the slideshow off, I think.
No, there it is, right?
There we go.
Okay. It's just that I can't see anything else but that slideshow, but that should be okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, as long as I can see it.
You got to be careful what you share, though.
What's that, sorry?
You've got to be careful what you share.
Yeah. This means that, yeah. Well, yeah. That's a universal principle, isn't it? Be careful what you share.
Indeed, it existed long before such virtual meetings were possible.
Sharing is not always a good thing.
My daughters frequently remind me that it's caring, so it's of universal application.
What? Sharing is caring.
Sharing is caring.
Yeah, but don't always care about the right things.
Tumelo, your sound is very loud. Could you perhaps mute it?
I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
What? It says I'm muted.
Now you're
Nice.
muted. Thanks.
Yeah, there
I
we go.
just muted Dumelo.
I should keep track of time. There we go.
Okay, we're going to start in the next 1 minute.
Okay, thanks, Sunny.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
I can hear
Yep.
you.
Lovely stuff. Good morning. I hope you're all doing well. And welcome to this first seminar of the year with the discipline of philosophy in UNISA. My name is Sanelisiwe Ndlovu. I'm a lecturer in the discipline of philosophy in UNISA. On behalf of the philosophy discipline, you're all welcome and thank you so much for making the time. And a big thank you to our speaker, Dr. Christopher. So a little bit about our speaker today. Dr. Chris is the director of the Center for Leadership in Ethics in Africa. Leads the RNA. He is an editor of the Era and South African Journal of Philosophy. His research in African political theory and ethics, intellectual history, and critical theory examines consistent conceptions of rights, colonialism, land reform, critique, and ideological legitimation. So his talk today is titled African Recognition of Dignity as a Basis for Universal Human Rights. Dr. Chris, thank you so much for making the time and joining us. I'm going to hand over to you. So I'm going to give our speaker 30 minutes, and from there, we're going to open up the floor for questions. Dr. Chris,
Okay.
over to you.
Thanks very much, Sunny. I will get right into it then in 30 minutes. I've been working on this general theory of rights recognition for quite a while, so it's all been a whole bunch of stuff packed into it. But I'll be focusing really on dignity as a common good criterion for the recognition of human rights today, because I recently was convinced by my colleague, Matsamai Molefe, to look more closely into human dignity, and I sort of changed my view of dignity on the basis of my research, and it became quite useful for me for this rights recognition theory that I've been pushing for a little while. So just to give an overview of what I'm up against and what I'm working with. So first of all, on human dignity, I'm going to be working, or I am working with Menkiti's view of dignity. And he, as you probably know, sees dignity as a matter of recognition, respect. It's the achievement of personhood for outstanding virtue in contribution to the common good. And what's peculiar about his account and controversial is that he thinks that not everyone has dignity. It's an achievement. So that's a problem if dignity is supposed to underwrite human rights. Madlingosi and also Vincent Lloyd have argued against recognition as a basis for dignity. They've argued that the struggle for dignity, specifically Black dignity, against anti-Black racism does not depend on recognition. And what they're saying there is that Black people are not asking for inclusion into a white world. And also that recognition is a basis for dignity. What we recognize is often exclusionary. So it's not an adequate basis. Then there's David Boucher, an international political theorist. And he argues that human dignity, I'm working with his view, but he argues that dignity, and this is what I thought before I looked into it, it's a convenient fiction. It's just a nice thing we say as a basis for universal human rights. And universal rights are actually derived, in fact, from customary social practices, in fact, specifically practices of international law, which are fundamentally codifications of European international law, which arose over time through war and compromise. And then there's also Jeje and my colleague Matsumai Molefe. They say that Menkiti's account of recognition respect can't provide an adequate basis for the universality of human rights. And that's because it's not for everyone or human. And they say rather that although they make a qualification saying there are two kinds of dignity, recognition, respect. There's recognition, respect, which Menkiti talks about, and then there's also status respect, which is just the status of being a human demands respect in itself, and so all humans have that, and that's how you get to universal rights from dignity. So, don't know how long I can get through this really, but quickly, the Western tradition of dignity is based on a theological idea of the imago Dei, saying that humans are exceptional and that the Spirit of God gives each human being dignity. And then there's an analogous African tradition that says God gives a speck of vitality to all humans as a basis of dignity. And there's various ways of cashing that out, which basically say that dignity specifies the inherent worth of a human person, of every human person. With Kant, that's because of our autonomy, because we think for ourselves, we determine our own the morals that we follow, and there's an intrinsic goodness to humans that's due to the capacity to give ourselves moral laws. So that's our autonomy. Anyway, so Rosen talks about these traditions. He says it's something intangible. Dignity is something intangible. Kind of you might read into that and make believe that all human beings carry inalienably that underlies the moral claims they have just by being human. So it might just be like a convenient fudge. Oh, this imaginary thing that everyone has. That's why we have it. And that's problematic. Anyway, to continue with this, it's a non-instrumental intrinsic value which founds human rights. It's distinctive because in a long European tradition, humans are distinctive because we choose our dignity, our destiny. And Kant says, well, one must be treated as an end in oneself, not as a means to an end. That's how he cashes out dignity. And it's this this intrinsic character of dignity, something that can't be, that everyone has, that makes it appropriate as a value for all human rights, a sort of foundational value for human rights. So Rosen says that dignity, a modern understanding, must explain and justify the claim that we share inviolable dignity, that we're all free and equal, must show that we have inviolable and inalienable rights, and it must also identify, and this is problematic, I think, must also, this understanding of dignity somehow must identify what those rights are. So it's like a big bag that you can pull out the human rights from. And I think that's kind of problematic. I just treat it as a criterion for the human rights that we have, as I'll explain. There's been a lot of criticism in the West of dignity. Nietzsche says dignity, well, it used to belong to nobles, and now it's just a bunch of not nobles, slaves, hiding their slavery from themselves. So it's a slave value, a value of ressentiment and wishful thinking. Well, we have dignity too, and what the nobles think is dignified is not dignified. Then Ruth Macklin says it's a useless concept. There's much better notions that we have that we should use. And actually, it just means respect for persons or their autonomy. And because it's got so many different meanings through its genealogy, that we should just ditch it. Pinker also says it's a stupid, redundant concept. We've got better ones, such as autonomy or informed consent. Catherine McKinnon says substantive equality works better than dignity. It's more precise, does the real work, which is about bringing about equitable outcomes. And then there's David Boucher, very influenced by his work. He says the idea that the universality of human rights belong to features of human nature we all share is just, it's prevalent, but it's convenient fiction. In fact, rights don't inhere in dignity. Rights come from social practices. They actually arise historically, and they're inherent in social practices. So he pushes the view, which I'm going to agree with, well, I do agree with, that recognition makes and acknowledges rights. And this is a rejection of the natural rights view of human rights. So human rights are not natural rights, they're human rights, and we get them because we recognize them. It's because we recognize them universally that they are universal, but they come from our customary practices. They're not there before us. We're the ones who make them. Then there's an African critique. We can, well, maybe not one, but there's African critiques of indignity and dignity. So on the one hand, there's a long anti-colonial struggle against mistreatment and against indignity for the recognition of African dignity, since Africans were not recognized with dignity by Westerners, particularly who enslaved them. And yet, African scholars have often criticized the Western concept of dignity, even though dignity is something being fought for. So Menkiti says that most Western views of man abstract some character, so some abstract property, and make it the defining essential characteristic of the human, whereas he says that the African view denies that persons can be defined by focusing on one specific characteristic of an individual. So he's against the individualization and the abstraction. He says the community defines the person or personhood and dignity. It's not some isolated static quality of rationality, will, or memory. So it comes out of communal relationships of recognition. And that, as you can probably tell, accords with Boucher's view that dignity comes from customary practices of recognition. And so I bring these two together, these two traditions together. Also, Werridu agrees with it, that dignity is social or communal, defined by the community. And so does Koba. Koba makes a complaint that I want to pick up on, which is that natural rights conceptions of dignity deny culture So they deny that dignity is a cultural construct. He says we should talk about rights within a cultural context. And if you think about it, African philosophy is explicit about its cultural foundations. And so an African philosophical concept of dignity ought to acknowledge that cultural basis of a concept like dignity. So it says the liberal concept of human rights is natural rights belonging to persons in view of inherent autonomy, like not a cultural construct. That's too individualistic, and it omits our social political relationships that inform our conception of rights. So the basic unit of society for African communitarians is not the individual, but a social structure of relations. Okay, so where do we get this from? Where do we go from here? Cobber thinks that rights and duties should be organized and are organized around principles of respect, restraint, responsibility, and reciprocity. Respect, and that's where I want to. That's where I think dignity belongs, and that's why I want to say about to push for an African ethical conception of dignity as a basis for human rights, where mutual accommodation and respect is key. Now, Ifeanyi picks up on Menkiti's account of dignity, and he pushes it quite far, especially the point that dignity is something attained in a community. And so he really, he takes the bullet. He says that human dignity does not belong to everyone, but that's a serious problem if dignity is supposed to underwrite human rights, which do belong to everyone. So the problem with communal dignity for human rights, if it's defined by the community or belongs to recognized social practices, it begs the question, how can it inhere in every individual by human nature? Or how can it just belong to every individual if it depends on social recognition? And that's the thing. Recognition can be exclusionary. Humans are not always lovely people who recognize each other. Our recognition can be exclusionary. And we need human rights, specifically when that happens. So maybe dignity needs to go beyond recognition, you might argue, and some people do. Oyowe complains, it's difficult to see how rights and privileges can be assigned at all or justly distributed in direct proportion to respect. Molefe says that the repudiation of the ontological approach to dignity, so yeah, in favor of a performance one, sacrifices the egalitarianism that underpins the universality of rights. JJ, I'm sure you all know what JJ says. So I want to say no to that. It's not, can't be a natural capacity. That conceptions of dignity are socially and culturally determined, not natural, intrinsic, inherent, or individual, but and they follow from recognition, but they belong to everyone. So they follow from recognition and they belong to everyone. And I think you can find that in African ethics. And I think African ethics is useful because African communitarianism rightly affirms the social relationships and the web of communal duties that the concept of dignity must entail. So immediately I'm flagging the problem with my view by pointing to slavery, which was not universally recognized as a problem until, relatively recently. And I want to say the right not to be enslaved is an unnatural right, something we've made. So I'm trying to show you those pictures because when everyone was talking about natural rights in America, they were also, they had slaves. Privatization of an African social relationship. So let's turn to Thad Metz, who provides, I've jumped there quite quickly. he says that humans exhibit a superlative non-instrumental value. So he's got an African ethical conception of dignity, which does not depend on recognition, although he says it does depend on relationality. So instead of a Kantian account of dignity grounded on rationality, he suggests relationality. So he says the dignity of each person, of persons, is grounded in our relational capacity. So before we all start being nasty to each other in our human way, we have a capacity for friendly relations, and it's that you can derive dignity as a basis for human rights. So for a state to treat people as special in virtue of the capacity for human relationships must not degrade their abilities to commune, our capacity to be nice to each other. Don't look at what we do, just look at what we have a capacity to do, which is we could be nice to each other. The capacity for relationality functions, though, this is the problem, it functions a lot like rationality. So it accords with the capacity for each person for relationality, and not with the ethical character of respect between people. I think that this relationality is a curious attribute. It's relational, it's between people, but it doesn't actually come from relations between people. It just exists in each person. So it's an individual capacity for relations. It sounds like a bit of a fudge between people, but in a person. A bit like a transcendental kernel of natural capacity to harmonize with others. So I just find that quite suspicious and slightly inconsistent, because it doesn't come from how we treat each other. It's for how we our capacity to be nice to each other. It's a social relation. I think that dignity is a social relation. It comes from our relations with each other. It's something we recognize. It comes from our recognition, practices of recognition. And so I agree to some extent with Ikwenubi that it's not a capacity we were born with by nature. I'm going against this natural rights conception of dignity. It arises from interactions with others in a social context, but I don't think that it doesn't belong to everyone. In fact, I'd say when Menkiti claims that the dignity of a person depends on recognition from others, it's important to recognize that norm, the communal norm of appraisal, depends on treating everyone well. And so the norm itself implies a common good criterion. So even though it's attributed to a person on the basis of achievement, the norm itself specifies that that person achieves that norm because the norm itself is about benefiting everyone. It's about benefiting the common good. So it's the common good criterion that comes from that respect that I want to say serves as a basis for human rights. That is mutual recognition of dignity of people among one another, yields a criterion of the common good, which is necessary for any human right. Any human right ought to meet that criterion. The ideal of human dignity applies to all human beings equally, and it arises from communal relations of respect. So in this, I agree with Ramose, who says African ethics does not need to be underpinned by a comprehensive basic norm like relationality or rationality. Rather, in African ethics, moral terms illuminate different moral practices in a variety of contexts, speaking to a multiplicity of ethical principles, without any implicit claim to immutability, essentiality, or eternity, some kind of natural right. They are fluid and practiced. A pluralism of ethical norms has to be admitted. So he thinks to dissolve the specificity of Ubuntu into abstract universality, like relationality, principle of relationality, that denies its right to be different. And he has a long critique there. He says Ubuntu is a principle that we act humanely with respect towards others as a way of demanding the same from them. So to that extent, I agree with him, and I draw on his work in my conception of dignity as a basis for universal human rights. I think that dignity between persons entails mutual respect. And packing dignity into a natural human capacity distracts from the normative human relationships that dignity entails. And to avoid that, we should just say that the universality of human rights shows that they satisfy the criterion of human dignity. So human dignity stands as a criterion for the universality of human rights. We have human rights because they follow from comprehensive moral doctrines. We have various practices of how we think we ought to treat each other from the way that we behave. And though that's where we get our human rights from, and dignity follows from mutual respect, and it's a criterion that all human rights must meet. So dignity determines that our human rights must belong equally to everyone, and dignity itself comes from recognized customary practices of recognition respect, as we see with Menkiti's construal thereof. That's basically what I'm trying to say in a nutshell. I have more to say though, and I've got 5 minutes to do it. So let's see. So Ramosa's formulation, a little thing about Ramosa, it sounds like he's inconsistent. He said his formulation of Ubuntu, which is that it belongs to the human dignity of reciprocal recognition between persons, belonging to all human rights and duties as a basic ethic, as I agree with him. It seems like a comprehensive basic norm. So is this construal of dignity a comprehensive basic norm, which is supposed to account for what human rights have in common? Is it a bit like relationality, which he complains about? So I say no. Well, the social ontology of dignity yields a criterion for human rights, but it does not tell us what all human rights are or what they have in common. So it's not like relationality. It's not saying what human rights should be, which is what Rosen wanted from dignity. But it is a criterion for human rights that human rights must meet. And it's not stipulated in advance a priori as a natural thing, but it can be derived from our social practices of recognition. It's a common good criterion that we actually do recognize in our practices. As you can see with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which everyone signs up to. So dignity is a regulative ideal for human rights. It's not a transcendental kernel whose outcome is inherent. It's not a thing or property. It's an ethical manner of respect that we owe to each other and which we practice in mutual recognition. Doesn't operate as part of a chain of propositions from which to deduce a rational response to a particular problem the world has for us. It's a contested term, which leads to various ethical maxims regarding moral conduct, but it functions as a regulative ideal that informs the rules we deploy in our moral doctrines. Not an individual capacity, something exchanged, as African communitarian ethics supports. African studies of human dignity show that moral progress is born of the struggle for recognition against treatment, undignified treatment, but it's also worth attending not just to the struggle for recognition, but the positive moral emphasis of communal social practices of dignity. And why? Well, to correct misconceptions of dignity, rationalizations of it as a natural, as dignity, as support, on natural rights, construal of human rights, which I think frees the living spirit of the law into a conceptual fossil, like autonomy. So it doesn't belong to a single person, depends on a social dynamic of mutual recognition, and it's not a right in itself. It's more of a watchdog for the common good than a robust social theory, as Masolo says. So it's a common good criterion for the human rights that we have, the long list of them, which follow from customary social practices, which we all agree on. And basically its function is no comprehensive moral doctrine may stipulate a human right that does not apply to everyone. That's what dignity does in our human rights, regulative ideal. So you might say, no, you're wrong, Chris. Human rights do not presuppose mutual recognition. Doesn't depend on contingent social practices. And I would say in response, drawing on Rex Martin, that a principle only counts as moral or having moral authority if it ties with actual moral beliefs. And that's because human rights need to have moral authority. If we don't recognize them, then they can't offer that authority, and then they don't do what they're supposed to do. So human rights can't do what they're supposed to do unless they have moral authority. They only have moral authority if they are recognized. So we can only get human rights from recognized practices. An ideal morality that lacks recognition doesn't provide authority, but that's precisely what morality is expected to provide. So human rights must be recognized to have any moral authority. Moral recognition is crucial to human rights' normative and practical roles, moral justification and institutional embodiment. So Gauss, I've actually run out of time, but Gauss says a right is a moral claim involving a power, it's recognized, and it contributes to a common good. And I think dignity offers that third attribute, which is that that a right should contribute to a common good. So yeah.
Chris, you can have an additional 7 minutes.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. I'll quickly just say why, because I'm actually borrowing quite heavily from Rex Martin and Gerald Gauss. And they both stipulate a common good as a criterion for human rights. But but the thing is, they stipulate the common good a priori as a necessary criterion for the common good. And they've got this account of human rights, which depends on recognition. So then seems to me there's a bit of inconsistency because they're stipulating the common good rather than finding it or deriving it from customary practices. Whereas by contrast, my account of the common good, which also stipulates as an a priori necessary criterion, nevertheless can be derived from mutual recognition respect in African ethics, which demonstrate that this criterion need not be stipulated, but follows from actual recognition practices. So just like human rights follow from recognized customary practices in our overlapping comprehensive moral doctrines, so does dignity as a common good constraint. And therefore, at last, after many years of work, having turned to dignity despite my suspicion that it's convenient fiction, I think that it can help us to put forward a rights recognition theory with recourse to African communitarian ethics, such that an active or successful human right must meet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the criterion of mutual recognition, which means that it is justified by critical moral standards of overlapping consensus, such that almost everyone agrees that these rights serve the common good to the benefit of each and all. And that accredited way of acting or being treated must have some sort of significant social recognition in living customary law. And in the case of an active human right, there must be official recognition of these ways in law and in the action of courts, in official customary law, or there's a situation of these ways in legally supported and regulated social and economic institutions. So there must be a formal recognition of that way of acting. It must have social recognition, official recognition, and it should be maintained primarily, not through force from law, but by conforming conduct in our customary practices, and if need be, officially protected through oversight and enforcement by a government. So human rights are not just any old rights. They're rights that specifically speak to states, which are required to enforce them. And states have signed up to universal human rights. So they ought to. And then there's a universality criterion for all human rights, which I think you can get from dignity, which is a practice of mutual respect, and the that's a common good criterion, a universality criterion, that human rights could be seen by most people to benefit most people. And then they're accredited by overlapping consensus and the convergence of comprehensive moral doctrines. So that's what a human right is, and it depends on dignity. And that's it. That's the end of slideshow. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was very interesting conversation. So I'm now going to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand. So while waiting for those hands, Chris, I do have a question.
Oh, yeah?
So I'm just like wondering, seems like your idea of dignity is very grounded on this idea of African communitarian personhood, right? And when looking at, especially with the Menkitian idea of personhood, some people argue that it doesn't accommodate human rights. So I'm just wondering, don't you think that there's a clash, right? We can't accommodate human rights on a theory that focuses so much on relationality and community. Seems like you're always going to prioritize the community over the human rights. Hope that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Well, it does. I guess he's referring to a bounded community, and that's where the problem might come in. You might find that two communities clash, I guess. But what am I doing? I'm universalizing that. So I'm saying that the actual practice of recognition of dignity is bound by a norm of the common good. And when we speak of human rights, then we speak of the common good of all. So there's a common good constraint in his norm, and human rights pick up on that common good constraint. That you can't have a right which doesn't meet the common good. Yeah, I don't know if that's satisfying. I hope I haven't frozen, because you kind of have.
I can still hear you. I think it's
Okay.
the video because of the bad weather in Pretoria. But yeah, thank you. That makes sense. I see
Yeah.
we have another hand. Charles, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
There we go. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Charles.
Thank you for a very interesting webinar. It's fascinating. Yeah, so I think you know probably where I'm coming from with mutual recognition. You've listened to my stuff over the years, so and I find it interesting that it's fascinating the conclusions you come to. The work I do mainly involves Honneth and Fanon, as you know. And I think they would, to a large extent, be in agreement with you. So this is more of a comment and a question that Fanon sees mutual recognition as praxis, in a sense, as something that happens in our daily encounters with other people. So also not something that is about someone's essence. It's about human values, the recognition of human values, but to a large extent, it's something that is practiced instead of being some essence inherent in someone. Whereas Honneth sees it as primarily, I guess, a social, psychological kind of development, mutual recognition that comes prior to human rights, which is, more kind of the political, I guess, for him, the political development of mutual recognition that involves a political, civil society kind of development of mutual recognition. But yeah, I just found that so there's more of a comment, that I think to a large extent they would be in agreement with us, to a kind of formulation of mutual recognition to a large extent, or at least, you're formulating dignity, but also the way that mutual recognition works in relation to dignity. I don't know if it makes sense, but thanks.
Yeah. Hey, that does make sense. I guess I agree with them, and perhaps it's quite. Hey, you know what? It could be quite useful then to compare those accounts, to look at African communitarian conceptions of dignity, and customary practices of dignity, and to compare them to their accounts. And hey, then you will have a happy meeting between two traditions, which are very distinctive. And you might find lots of fruitful points of complementary philosophical practices from that. So Honneth finds it goes back to childhood. And I say that it goes back to the group. The group. And yet it is pre-political. I guess political is what. No, I'm just not. Actually, it's not pre-political in my account, because it's about how we ought to govern our behavior. I don't know if you. Yeah, if I wouldn't maybe hold a strong abstraction between those two.
Yeah.
But there's a common agreement there that it comes from praxis. That's an anti-essentialist point of view. Also, perhaps, I don't know if it's anti-foundational. I don't know. I used to be entranced by Rorty, but I don't know anymore. For the anti-foundationalism, because it does seem to be serving a foundational basis in my account. But I think I would agree then with Ramosa that there's various ethical practices that could come to accord with dignity. And that's something I think I want to push, because although I'm deriving this from an African communitarian ethics, I think, in fact, I don't think we can see that people from various parts of the world with very different comprehensive moral doctrines have come to an overlapping consensus on the list of human rights that we have. So it might just be that they're cashed out so generally that anyone could agree with them, even if they disagree with each other actually in practice. But they do provide ideals that everyone agrees with, and I don't think we need to stipulate them in advance of people's ethics, because it happens to be the case that our ethical systems have overlapped on these human rights. So we don't need to shy away from the praxis. In fact, we should have more trust in our ethics. people might complain though. They might say, you know, there's been times when, for instance, where people have endorsed slavery, and that's the hard response.
Yeah. Endorse slavery next to, you know, advocating human rights, etc.
Well, yeah.
Or dignity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And for instance, the United States agrees that you shouldn't torture people. In fact, they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
They do torture people, and they think it's right to do so. So there's an inconsistency there. However, it's worth noting when they do torture people, they try to keep it on the low down. So they don't go out there and officially justify it. And so you could say that even then there's a recognition of the right not to be tortured.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's complicated, isn't it? You know, you have these, you always have that paradox.
Yeah, what we do, you're trying to get the rights from what we do, but what we do is sometimes awful.
Yeah.
So you could rather say it's looking at our customary practices, you can derive ideals about what we think we ought to do rather than what we actually do.
Yeah.
It's a bit like parents speaking to their children. This is what you should do. Children look at their parents and go, but you don't do that. Don't smoke, even though I do.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. I'm going to take a hand from Londi. Patricia can go next. And Oya, you can go after Patricia.
Perfect. Hello. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Hello.
Oh, hi. All the way from Cape Town. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. And I think the concepts are of really such importance, particularly when you're touching on, you know, dignity and how you're combining it together with practices from this particular continent. I think that's amazing. So I just want to juxtapose it with some other things I've recently been learning about. So Adam Smith, for example, is of particular interest to me. And it seems like they have a concept of, for example, human nature that is very different. And so they say we are inherently selfish, and, you know, human nature is brutish and nasty. But instead of trying to run away from it, embrace it, and let people be selfish, because that's the way that we can technically elevate ourselves, right? Just
yeah.
validate. So with concepts like dignity, maybe to their mind, they might be beyond us in a certain respect. And I just wanted to hear from you, like how you would treat, you know, the concept of, but human nature is this way, right? And yet perhaps dignity is not even worth striving for. I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate, but I just really wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Hey, that's quite a productive line of thought. A few things come out of what you're saying there. I was also thinking of Hobbes. Hobbes saying, you know, in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And the human nature, by human beings, are inherently selfish. And any political system that tries to get away from that, that depends on us not being self-interested, is never going to work. But where we can go from there is that it's in our interests not to live a life that is nasty, brutish, and short. And so we ought to put into place political practices that protect our interests. Therefore, it would be in our interests to have a common set of principles that regulate our behavior so that we don't have a horrible time. On the other hand, I find the idea of human nature quite problematic. I'm quite influenced by this move from Pico della Mirandola, who I mentioned, to Kant, to Marx, which consistently maintains that human nature is made, not found. So what's interesting about us is that we have made ourselves what we are. Society is a product of our intentional decisions. And so I don't know if we can really say what human nature is, since we're always in society and we're using language, stuff we've done, we've made, it's constructed. And we wouldn't know what it is outside of the constructions that we have by which we understand things, such as our concepts. So human nature in itself is quite a problematic term. And given that we can decide how we live together, and we do decide how we live together, where we ought to do so correctly in a way that protects our interests, the common good of all, since that's in the interests of each. Yeah.
That was very interesting. Thank you for answering. So just to double check, you're saying that human nature in and of itself is a concept that's quite problematic, right? And can we really know what it is? Because we are within a society that's already been, in a sense, constructed for us. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess I'm raising an epistemological problem. So, like, how can we know what it is? Using our language, for instance, which is constructed by us. Even the concept itself, human nature, is a concept we've made. So what is it outside of how we've made ourselves? That's the problem of self-reflective creatures such as ourselves that determine the moral laws by which we live. So we determine how we live. We've got freedom. So if you're free, nature does not dictate what you do. Yeah.
Just a final point, because I don't want to hog all the time from other speakers who would like to ask a question. But I just wanted to say, I find it interesting that even in this instance, when we're protecting the interests of the community, in a sense, it's also still self-serving because we get to benefit from that at the same time. Just a final comment.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Adam Smith has a kind of a happy accident that if we all follow our self-interests, then we will end up benefiting each other. And I guess that's following from the intuition that if we don't benefit each other, then it's not in our interests, not in our self-interest. Because we live together with each other, it's in each person's interests that we don't mess with each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Chris. Londi, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Sane. Hi, everyone. Hi, Chris.
Hey, hello.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. You have given us quite a big bread that we'll have to digest in a.
Thanks for coming along, Londi.
Cool. My question is short and probably simple. It's on what you refer as a common good. I want to kind of catch up on how do we derive what we later call common good, and are you of the view that it is by its nature universal?
Yeah, that's right.
And how does it in praxis? How does it play out? Is it in a form of human rights or what?
Okay. I think we can derive it from practices of recognition, respect. So when we recognize someone as having personhood, someone has Ubuntu, then we say, hey, you're a good person because the kind of things you do, we've been watching you, we see the way you behave. When you act, you try to benefit the common good. You don't bully one person. You don't try and steal from all of us. All the stuff you do, has we can see that you're trying to benefit everyone. And so we like that about you. That's why we're going to sing your praises. And maybe not because of you, but just because it's good for us to sing the praises of people who are good for us. So although some people have said, hey, that's very individualizing. If you can only say that someone has Ubuntu because when they've managed to achieve this, and we don't all achieve that. Some of us are awful sometimes, and sometimes some of us are awful quite a lot of the time. And how can you get dignity, which needs to belong to everyone, yeah? If it's to serve as the basis for universal human rights, how can you get dignity from recognition, respect like that? And then, so my response is that although that's attributed to the person, it's because they're benefiting the common good. And so the norm then that we're praising is a norm that respects the common good. So even if it's individually attributed, it's something that's attributed because it benefits everyone. And so we get that common good benefit from these practices of recognition, respect, that we praise certain people. So there's something that's universal there, even though it's attributed to a person. And in that praise singing, we can see in that customary practice of praise singing, of exceptional virtue, we can get a norm of the common good, which we then make a criterion for human rights. So all human rights should meet that norm, that they serve the common good. And that's not something we stipulate in advance, or it's not something that we derive from human nature. It's something we actually can derive from practices of recognition, respect.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Chris. I'm going to take one
Thank
last
you.
question or comment from Oyekule.
All right, thank you so much. Chris, the very nice presentation you have made regarding African rights recognition thesis, and you laid a good foundation for your thesis. I just quickly want to ask these two questions. The first is that under what theory can we categorize this thesis to be? If I want to categorize, for instance, I want to categorize Menkiti's perspective of human dignity and rights, as well as that of Molefe, I could categorize that of Menkiti as that of purely behaviorist, and the other, for instance, the relationality conception of dignity, human dignity and right could come up under cognitive constructivist theory. So from what theoretical perspective is your envisioned African human rights recognition thesis could be categorized? That is the first question. And the second one is I want to ask that what is the view of this theory, this African rights recognition theories, in taking cognizance of the modern human world?
Oh, as opposed to like a traditional village.
Hello,
Yes.
you said what?
You mean, so how do I reckon this with the modern human world, given that it seems
Yes,
to appeal to an idealized African village in the distant fictional
yes,
past of
and
Wakanda?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. As long as I understand you right there. So maybe I'm not sure how to respond to the second question. I'll think about it. But I don't know how to categorize my account. I guess it's constructivist. I'm arguing against the natural rights perspective of human rights. And it's communitarian, so it's based on a communitarian ethics. And I also I guess it's I disagree with my colleague Motsamai, who seems to be siding, or at least agreeing with Fad Metz's account of relationality to some extent, because I think that packaging relationality into a capacity gets away from the praxis of human relations. So if it's something, I don't see how relationality is something we're born with. I mean, it may be that some of us are not even born very relational. Some of us are kind of born quite autistic, or there's lots of different ways we're born. I don't know why we need to package it into the way we're born, into some kind of genetic code of dignity. I think we can just look at the way people behave, and we can get dignity from our behavior with each other. I don't, and I'm arguing that we shouldn't shy away from basing our human rights on what we actually endorse, what we actually recognize, even though humans are quite problematic. There's some things we endorse, which are for the common good of all, and there's other things which we do, which we wouldn't endorse as being for the common good of all. And so our practices of recognition, respect, provide that common good criterion, which human rights ought to meet. And we can get that from what we actually do. So we do actually sing the praises of people who serve the common good. And actually in praise singing, you find it's not always just, you're such a wonderful person. Often in praise singing, like singing the praises of a ruler, there's a barbed critique there, like there's quite a subtle critique going on, which is, but you also did some dodgy stuff there, mate. Even though you're such an amazing ruler, don't forget that you shouldn't do those dodgy things that we're going to embarrass you when we sing your praises. So there's always a call to the common good, and it's because it's in the common good, the interests of each, to sing such praises. Anyway, I'm getting away from categorizing my work because I'm not quite sure how to categorize it. But I'd say it's constructivist and it's communitarian. So I'm definitely arguing against natural rights conceptions of human rights. And then
so
how do I think
that could count? Sorry. Oh, sorry. That could count as a social constructivist theory then.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So
I'm very influenced by Karl Marx, and historical materialism. That everything, the concepts come from culture. You find that in Wiradoo as well. In fact, there's going to be a talk today Fort Hare's hosting, not just draw you away from UNISA, but at 1 o'clock, Helen Hauer will be talking about Wiradoo's reading of Quine. Quine, also thinks that science is a culture, interestingly. Okay, so how does it relate to the modern world if it comes from the village? Well, I think the village, maybe it's an idealized picture of the village. You might find that in the village, people were very nasty to each other. My experience of small towns is that everyone knows all the nasty things about each other, and we know that we're not very nice to each other. So I don't know what's so idealized about the village, but nevertheless, there's social norms that arise from the village context. And in the international modern context, we're still human beings. We're still self-interested. And it's still in our interest to ensure that ethical norms meet the criterion of the common good. So no matter how big the world gets full of people, it's in our interests that our good practices are for the good of all, and don't go against anyone specifically or any group specifically. It'd be very difficult to endorse in the modern view. I don't see how the village is different from modern society. It doesn't mean suddenly we should not endorse human rights for all.
All right, thank you so much.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for the engaging talk. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you for the great questions and comments.
Yeah,
Please,
thanks, everyone.
yeah. So please be on the lookout for our upcoming event. For our next seminar, our guest speaker is going to be Professor Michael Kluter, whose talk will focus on reflections on the meta-narrative of constitutional supremacy in post-apartheid South Africa. We'll advertise this talk on various platforms. Thank you again, Dr. Chris, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much for having me. And thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks. Hey, Sanelisa, can I get a copy of the recording?
Yes, I'll make sure you get that.
Sanelisiwe, sorry, not Sanelisa. Sanelisiwe. Okay, thanks. Maybe if you could just email me a link or something.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. That's great. I'm glad you're doing these seminars. That's really good. It was quite a long time ago. I came along to a speak at UNISA. I was very nervous speaking at UNISA because of the
this was a great turnout. It was very engaging.
yeah. Hey, UNISA's always had a very strong critical tradition of philosophy, and a strong African philosophical basis. So that's why it's an honor